and welcome back to the Code for Couples podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Stephanie Kahn, and I learned about Dr. Kahn. Do you want me to call you Dr. Kahn or Stephanie?
Stephanie.
Stephanie, cool, because that's what I always calling you. Okay, so I learned about Stephanie when her book was recommended to me, and I picked up the book probably in November, got around to reading it, and was reading it on a plane and could not put it down because of all the amazing content that's in this book. And just the way that she wrote it. So I asked her, reached out to her to see if she would be on our podcast today. Her book is Increasing Resiliency, her book is Increasing Resilience in Police and Emergency Personnel, Strengthening Your Mental Armor. She has a really cool story to tell as well. And so I am so happy to have her. Stephanie, thank you so much for agreeing to do this today.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me.
So I know you have this really unique background to you. It's not just, hey, I'm some girl that wrote a book, right? So
right.
You tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from. Why law enforcement?
Well, I grew up in a police household. My dad was an officer for almost 40 years. And so I grew up with, and it was in a small town in North Texas. And so I grew up with police in my living room at the kitchen table, having coffee, talking about calls, talking about city council, talking about those kinds of things. Yeah. Right, exactly. And so I grew up in that household, and I became a dispatcher call taker for a local agency, did that for a few years. And then decided to go to the other side of the radio and became an officer, which I did for Fort Worth, Texas. And in the meantime, I had met my husband, who was an officer for the department I was a dispatcher for, but I waited till I moved to the other department to start dating him, because that can be chaotic otherwise. And so I ended up marrying him and being this summer makes 20 years we've been together. So I've got it from having been the daughter of a police officer, having been a dispatcher, having been an officer, being married to an officer, and then just for extra kicks and giggles, I did victim service work for 3 years when I was doing my PhD. So I was still going out with people, with officers, making death notifications and those kinds of things, just to kind of keep myself out there in some capacity, working with trauma and police officers. So.
Yeah, so that's why I was so floored by this background that you have, that not only do you were a child growing up in it, but then you go into it and then marry an officer. So you have it from all angles, and you also work with officers in your clinical practice now.
Yes, and I did. Yes, I do work with officers, firefighters, EMS, corrections, dispatchers, the whole gamut of first responders. And then even when I was doing my master's degree in counseling and then my PhD in counseling, I specifically made it a point to research mental health issues, things like coping with secondary traumatic stress, police identity, first responders not retiring when they were eligible for retirement. What was that about? And my sense was that was about that identity and about that connection that they had with what the work that they did and the people that they did it with. And that's in fact part of what I learned when I did that research. So I've researched it as well, trained, presented, those kinds of things. And then even when I was an officer, I was on the peer support CISM team. And so that's where I kind of got kind of a taste for, maybe there's something more that I can do besides responding to the calls and being the peer supporter. Maybe there's something more that I can do when I saw there was a gap in culturally competent services for first responders.
That's awesome. And you have your practice where now?
It's just outside of Portland in a city called Beaverton, Oregon. So, okay. Yeah.
I knew you weren't in Fort Worth anymore. For some reason, I knew it was north and I couldn't remember where. So very good.
Yeah.
So in Oregon there.
Yep.
Okay. And your book is about resiliency. And yes. Let me tell you, first of all, this book is so well researched. I loved every aspect. And if you want to know what I think about the book, go on Amazon because I wrote a review and it's amazing. So well researched. And so it's written so down to earth and it just makes sense. It's not heady at all. It is real information. And I have been telling people it is one of my two main resources that I go to now next to Gilmartin's book.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for writing this book. What is it about resiliency? Like, why did you pick that topic? What was the inspiration?
Well, I think when you think about psychology and what their focus tends to be about pathology, about what's going wrong, why are relationships not making it? Why are people taking their lives? What is causing people to struggle with depression? And I really wanted to take a different slant. I wanted to say, what is it that's helping officers deal with their exposure to secondary traumatic stress? What is it that's helping officers to have an identity and a life outside of their work? And it's interesting because I wrote a mental health column for a police magazine for about 3.5 years. So every month I would write a one-pager. Here's this topic, know about this, understand that. Here's some pointers on this and that, the other. And when I was recruiting for my study on how officers were actually maintaining a life and an identity outside of their police work, I had so many people say, oh, well, you'll never get anybody to interview because the department doesn't let you have it. The public won't let you have a life or an identity outside of your work. The shift work won't let you have it. And so I had a lot of naysayers saying that I would not have anyone to interview. And the reality of it is I had more people than I needed. I actually had to shut off recruitment because I had a lot of people who had a lot to say about their strengths, about their ability to adapt to the givens of shift work, to the public scrutiny, to those kinds of things. And so I said, there are people out there that are doing it. And so I want to talk to those people, and I want us to actually shine a light on that part of the equation, because I think we do a pretty heavy-handed job of shining a light on the pathology. And I think that really skews the picture and could in fact even contribute to things like suicide and divorce, because people become discouraged. They're like, well, why bother trying anything else, because there's this kind of pessimistic view things are going to get you. And my research, the officers that I work with clinically, research-wise, that I know personally, would tell you, no, you can actually stay in a marriage. You can actually overcome trauma. You can, and I don't want to say overcome trauma free, but you can in fact work through those things. And I think I would like more company shining a light on those pieces, which is why I wrote the resilience book.
Oh, there we go. Okay. It's like, I lost you for a minute. We're having really bad storms here, so I don't know if that's impacting me or not. Yes, I actually totally agree with you, because we do a really good job, or there's a lot of information out there about how things fail, how people fall down, the really negative side. But when you look at the percentages, and in your book you highlight some of those percentages and state what I've been stating, is that there is not evidence that police marriages fail any more, law enforcement marriage fails any more so than any other marriages. But the statistic that gets out there all the time is this 75%, which I love that right in your book, you're like, yeah, I'm not finding that anywhere.
Yeah.
So it is focusing on this positive aspect of how people do overcome and bounce back. And that's what I consider resiliency. What do you consider resiliency?
Yeah. And I would say, I wouldn't even say that what I'm saying is positive as much as what I'm saying is realistic, and that's what's interesting is it's, some people say, well, that's the positive psychology approach. And you might think I'm sprinkling sugar on poop, and I'm not. So to put it bluntly,
yes.
But I'm talking about the reality.
Yes.
My husband and I have been together for 20 years. Our two best friends are married couples who've also been together for 20 years and are just blissfully happy. Not that everyone's like never having any problems, but yeah. But I just wanted.
That's the reality of marriage too, right?
Right.
That we every relationship can have struggles. It's just the struggles might be a little different. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. And so your question again, you asked what do I consider, or how do I define resiliency?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I consider resiliency, and I say that in my book, is I consider it a process. I liken it to officer safety, where you have to have whatever situation you're walking up to, whether it's a call, whether it's a family situation in your personal life, it's a health situation you're facing in your personal life, professional life, whatever you're talking about. It's a matter of coming up and assessing, what do I have here? What are the threats to me? What are the strengths? Who do I need at my side? Do I need an assist on this? What kind of assist do I need? And so it's really making an assessment about what your situation is and what it calls for. And then it's calling for those adjustments, those, again, and if it was an officer going to a call, they might say, I might have to adjust my stance. I need to kind of take one step back and kind of take more of a bladed position, because to make myself a smaller target for this person, or get my hands in the ready position, or call for an assist, or call for the medics to stage, or whatever. And so it's that assessment and those moment to moment adjustments that you make to try to make yourself safer and to minimize the risk factors. And I think we can do that in our life, where we say, okay, how is my health? What is going on there? How is my sleep? What kind of moment to moment adjustments do I need to make to be safer, to be healthier? Same thing in relationships. How are things going there? And if I'm not spending time with them because I'm spending a lot of time doing other things, what moment to moment adjustments do I need to make this week, or can I make, to make that healthier and more adaptive?
Yes, I love that. And so it's a constant adjustment and assessing. So there's this ongoing process of assessing and adjusting that happens. And I love that you're talking about how how an officer might do it in the field.
Yes.
And then how that also applies, that same process can apply in their life. And
Right.
so those same skills, they're just using
Yes.
it a different way.
Right. And which is really funny, because a lot of officers, when they talk about skills that they use to de-escalate things, or to deal with problematic employees, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't occur to them that stuff works at home. They're like, oh, you mean the things that I do there work at home as well? Yes, to a certain degree, although you've got to probably put a little more sugar on it when you're at home.
Yeah.
but but yeah, the same skill set.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. What are some of the consequences of somebody not paying attention to resiliency?
Well, if they're not paying attention, it's similar to someone walking on a scene and not being aware of the risk factors, and they need an assist. They get hurt. If you start to become complacent on calls that you attend, you're more apt to get hurt. You're more apt to, take poor reports because you're not paying attention to details, and you're going to be known as the person that's kind of phoning it in, so to speak, on calls. Well, the same thing happens in your life. If you are not aware, if you become complacent, you are going to find yourself in trouble, either health-wise, relationship-wise, financials, all the above. You will suffer those consequences. And unfortunately, that happens for a lot of people who just have what Jack Digliani refers to as a life by default. So just whatever comes their way occurs to them. And then because they haven't taken more of an aware, or more of a life by design kind of mentality towards it, then they find themselves scrambling to try to repair the damage. And sometimes, and I hate to say this, but oftentimes people will come in 7-8 years after something has really started to tick away at their well-being, or tick away at the health of the relationship. And it is sometimes too late by then, because the family members are done, or the health condition is there. And other times there's repair that can be made, but not without a lot more effort than would have been required had they come in sooner.
Yeah. So if they are taking care of themselves on a regular basis, then they don't have the greater damage. It's like, it's just like anything in our lives. And that isn't exclusive just to a law enforcement world or a first responder
Mm-mm.
world. I mean, that goes for everybody, because if we're not paying attention to what we're doing, or if we're not paying attention to taking care of ourselves, or we start to blame others as opposed to taking ownership of our own actions,
Right.
then we do have like this life by default. I mean, it's consequences that come from not paying attention all along the way.
Right.
So it's just, this isn't something that's exclusive just to our law enforcement or first responder world. It's
No.
applicable to everybody.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I
Yeah,
tell people, it's like you get tartar buildup on your teeth.
that's
you know,
perfect.
so you got to do some maintenance along the way to keep from having it being this horrific situation at the hygienist office, because you got a lot of buildup. You got a lot you've got to be dealing with, and it's quite painful at that point. And you have no one else to blame but you, because you're the one letting it build up.
Yeah, I love to think of it as plaque. Like, that's a
Right.
really good analogy with the plaque.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know that as a wife, and I'll say as a spouse, that sometimes in the early years, for sure, did my own share of enabling behavior as
Okay.
opposed to helping my husband to be more resilient, that I would enable him to kind of fall into the couch and become like a potato or
Yeah.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really great information in your book. Could you pick out some of the struggles that maybe you see couples making? Like, how do we become a resilient couple
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to just a resilient officer?
Yeah. I think, when you talk about the enabling, I have a saying, enabling is disabling.
Mhm.
And so it's so important that it's not to say that you say, hey, I'm not helping you with anything. I don't care that you had court after you had shift work, after you had, this and that. It's not that you hold a hard stance in that respect, but that
Mhm.
you don't do that on a consistent basis, because then you start to have these compensation behaviors for them not being involved in their lives, and I call it their lives because it's not their personal lives, and so they become exempt from participating in household things and family things, and then spouses become resentful involved in things, and then they become roommates because the first responder, the police officer, doesn't know what's going on in their children's lives or their families' lives, because the spouse is trying to shield them from that because they know they've had a hard night of work or day of work or those kinds of things. But then they become estranged because then they're not really aware of those things. And then similarly, the first responder will sometimes not tell their significant others about the kinds of calls that they've dealt with. And so
Mhm.
in an effort to try to shield them from the horrors of that, so then they don't know, they're not in on their world. And so then they start having those conversations with coworkers or other people, and then someone becomes this kind of work wife or work husband or whatever, and people are not, couples become estranged, they become roommates, and it's
Yeah.
not good. And so you've got to figure out ways as a resilient couple to be able to navigate the challenges of shift work and court and overtime and trauma and that kind of stuff, where you say, okay, we've got to find a way where you can still be involved in family life, but still get your rest. You've got to find a way that the spouses can know about their work life and work struggles without traumatizing them. So you got to figure out where those lines are and what they look like from week to week.
So what would you say, maybe I don't know if you have like a top 3 recommendations, but what would you say are some resilient techniques, or what are some techniques that couples need to implement besides, obviously one of the ones, I'm just stumbling all over myself right now. Obviously one of the ones that you just said was, make sure that you know each other's world. Have that
Yeah.
communication. So and both of you need to open up, both of you need to get curious about what's going on there, so you can remain intact and close and friends and partners.
Yeah.
What are some other ways that couples can become resilient?
Well, I mean, the communications is key, and also, excuse me, actually making sure, and this kind of comes back to Gilmartin stuff because I agree, it's his book is a great resource and has stood the test of time. Is getting away from that used to syndrome, as Gilmartin referred to it. I used to do this, we used to do that, we used to hang out with these people, we used to do these things together. And so making sure that you are not succumbing to used to syndrome, but rather you are still planning things, and you're planning to do things on days off that are fun, that are activities that help you to enjoy life and help him decompress from stress and help you decompress from stress, because everybody else also has stress in their lives. And so doing things together, and it's interesting because my husband and I both, when we were officers, worked overnights, and in the morning, which I later learned might not have been the best timing, but we would play roller hockey with each other just to, hey, how was your night? Oh, mine was fine. Oh, here, I'm going to try to skate past you and get this puck past you. And so we would do that. And that was an activity that we did before we went to sleep. I later learned it probably wasn't ideal for sleep because then you're getting your heart rate up and then trying to go to bed. But the idea was that we were going to do something fun together before we went on to sleep and those kinds of things. And so it's about making actual plans, because if you don't make plans and you say, well, let's see what I feel like doing when the weekend comes up, it will default to nothing. Again, it comes back to that life by default versus life by design. So that's one of the things, is making sure you're planning activities in advance, making sure that you're keeping your communication lines open, and that you're staying in each other's lives in significant ways, and not compensating for anybody's stress or strains or those kinds of things.
Yeah. So one of the areas of your book that I really loved was talking about flexible thinking.
Yes.
Because I think all of us, and I was even saying to my husband recently that I think the cynicism's worn off on me a little bit.
Yep.
So I love that there's this whole chapter in here about positive attitude, and I'll be careful because I don't, like you saying, like, I don't want to put sugar on poop kind of a thing, or I talk about rainbow sprinkles is what I do. But it's that a realistic optimism is kind of what you're talking about, and the flexible thinking. How can flexible thinking play into resiliency?
I think it's probably one of the strongest components of resiliency, because, and I tell people when I go do trainings, I said, skepticism is fine, because skepticism means I don't know if this is going to work out well. I don't know if I can trust this person, but I'm open to the idea to see the proof. Cynicism is an absolute no. It's a closed system. And and it's rigid. And so when your mind is closed and rigid in that way, nothing else gets in. You've already made up your mind, and your world becomes pretty small. The people you trust is very few. The activities you do, the places you'll go, it becomes you've painted yourself into a corner, and then ask, well, why do I feel so trapped and alone? Well, because your mindset has led you into that corner. And the reality of it is that the work does expose you to a thin slice of the population. And so I don't know what the exact percentage is, but if you deal with somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population on a repeated basis, and no one's calling you to the house to see how well little Johnny's doing, then you're going to believe that is the world. And you will have to be intentional to look at the other 90 to 95% of the world to see that, which requires some flexibility, which requires skepticism rather than cynicism. It requires you to be open to the idea that families are not falling apart in other places, that people are in fact finishing high school and going on and getting an education and doing these kinds of things. And because, gosh, if I did the same thing as a clinician that cops do in their line of work, I would believe that everyone was destined to be divorced and mentally ill and just a basket case. And that's like, I would go, oh my God, why am I even doing this anymore? It's a terrible, because it's a very self-limiting way of seeing the world, and which makes it very depressing.
Yes. And so being able to have that flexible thinking, because that's one of the, I hear about that a lot, like and it's one of the mistakes I made initially. I was being like, but honey, and I would put the sunshine sparkle around his negative thought. And that's really not where we're going. It's kind of like, okay, hey, expand the world, help to see that there is, yes, you can have the skepticism, which is a big difference than cynicism. And moving that around is something that helps the couple to engage as well. Because having skepticism about, well, I don't know about going there or doing that thing that we want to do. I have some reluctance and some fears in talking about that. And being aware of what's coming up is a really great way of bringing a couple closer together and not using the cynicism to drive them apart. So I thought that flexible thinking was really important. So we have I think a lot of times in behaviors and beliefs. And so we have behaviors of planning ahead, doing things, not just falling into a life. And being purposeful about it. But then you also are talking about, as far as the resiliency of the belief aspect of things, and changing that thinking and seeing the world in a different way. And so I like those two components as far as resiliency and what it takes to become a resilient couple.
Yeah.
One of the activities that you have in the book, and I don't know if you would really consider it an activity, but you have these two circles of work-life balance, and you have one of like describing the current situation and then moving it to an ideal situation, and how do you get there is the activity. I call it an activity, the activity that you have. And I think that that's something that couples can do as well, to sit down together and say, okay, what does this look like? Maybe even individually, and then do it together and have that conversation. Is that kind of the intent with that activity in your book?
Yeah, I think that one, and then just the annual check-in, because it's really about bringing that once again, coming back to that resilience. You can only ever really take steps to adapt to your circumstances if you are aware. And so you actually have to be very truthful with yourself when you're looking at that circle, and the circle is, how am I spending my time currently? What percentage of time am I spending at work versus in my social circle, in my health, in my spiritual practice, in my community, whatever your circle looks like. But and I think you have to have a realistic assessment of what that is, and then say, okay, now if I say that my family is most important to me, what do my behaviors actually tell me? Do the behaviors back up what I'm saying? If I'm identifying my family is most important, but I'm spending 10% or 5% of my time with my family, you're not putting your money where your mouth is. And so it's really about that. And then it's saying, okay, so what do I want it to be? Again, coming back to that life by design. And I do this exercise when I do resilience training. And I say, let's be realistic. We wouldn't say, okay, well, I realistically would want 5% of my time. Because that's not practical. And so instead, So I can repeat that. So when okay.
Sorry.
I was going to say, when I do the resilience training and I'm with first responders and I'm asking them to do this exercise, I ask them to be realistic, because they can't say, well, my ideal scenario would be that I'd spend 5% of my time at work and 90% of my time on a fishing boat.
Right.
That's right, because that's not reality. But what would their ideal be? And for them to really give it some thought. Because if they would want to spend 20% of their time in a social capacity, or 10% of their time towards their faith, or towards their, health or whatever, then to realistically identify what it would be, and then take the next step and say, okay, now let's put this into action. What's one thing you can do this week that would close the gap between where you are and where you would like to be? One identifiable goal. And then when they tell me, oh, well, I'll work out more. No, be more specific.
Mm.
What will you do? What will that look like? Be very specific, because I want you to make that adjustment. You wouldn't say when you went on a scene, well, I'd make myself slightly more safe when I perceived a threat. What does that mean? What would you actually do?
Right.
And be very specific about what you would do. And then you don't just stop there after week 1. You say, okay, and then the following week, what would you do? What extra change would you implement? And then you just keep going, because you're trying to close the gap between the actual and the ideal, with the recognition that you may need to repeat this exercise because your ideal might change. Your circumstance, well, it will change, and your circumstances will change as you age, and kids age and parents pass, and things change. So it's
Absolutely.
something to constantly revisit.
Yeah. So, and I love that you're saying that those changes need to be the specific, measurable, behavioral change, and it needs to be, hey, what's one thing you can do right now? What are you going to do tomorrow or this week? And it needs to be specific, not just, I love that you said work out more, because that's what a lot of people do. Oh, I'm going to work out. No, really, like, what are you going to do specifically? Mm-hmm. So having those specific goals as a couple can make the couple resilient, and make individuals resilient as well, obviously. So
right,
very good.
Because it takes 2 individuals doing their individual resilience plan to be a resilient couple.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So we each need to have those individual plans, and then one as a couple, and yes. think about ways that we want to specifically change to make our lives. I love that you called it life by design. To have this life by design, and how we're going to design that life.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. If somebody wanted to get a hold of you, how would they get a hold of you?
Well, it's easy to find me. I mean, firstresponderpsychology.com is the easiest way to do that, because from there, it has my email address, my phone number, my everything. It also has a preview on the landing page. There's a preview that you click on it, and it will let you download chapter 1 of my book if you want to see what is it about, and then it lets you see snippets of additional chapters. And so that's the easiest way, is just to go to firstresponderpsychology.com.
Okay, and I will attach that link in the podcast, in the information of the podcast, so everybody can click on it if you would like to do that. Any advice? This is one question I always ask all of my interviewees, all my guests, is that if there was one piece of advice or information that you wish somebody would have shared with you, what would it have been? Or what would it be?
That I wish that someone had shared with me when I was an officer, or just in life?
In your relationships.
One piece of advice I wish people would have shared with me in my relationship. I struggle with that question, because I think of the advice, I'm so used to being the helper. I think of the advice that I give to other people versus what I wish that people had said to me. And the one that I keep thinking of is that you treat love as a verb, not as a noun, which calls for actions on your part, because you can't, not unlike resilience, it's not something you have or don't have. It's something you actually have to practice.
Great. Thank you so much. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on. Stephanie Conn, if you want to get her book, it's on Amazon, or go to her website, and you can read more information about Stephanie and where she's doing her trainings, if you want to get in contact with her as well. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thanks for having me.